I never thought a simple afternoon at home could change everything. My name is Rachel, and I'm in my early 40s. I've been happily married to Mark for 3 years. Mark has a son, Jake, from his previous marriage, a quiet, respectful young man in his early 20s. When he first moved in with us to finish college, I didn't think much of it. He was polite and mostly kept to himself. But that day, everything shifted. Mark had left for a weekend business trip, leaving me and Jake alone in the house. It felt like any other Saturday morning. I threw on a loose tank top and shorts, comfortable clothes for cleaning. I turned up my favorite playlist and started wiping down the living room shelves, completely unaware that someone was watching me. I felt his presence before I saw him. When I turned around, Jake was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame. His eyes, they weren't the usual casual glance. They lingered, studied me in a way that made my skin heat. "Morning, Jake," I said with a smile, trying to brush off the sudden awareness that hung in the air. He returned the smile, but it was faint, hesitant. "Morning," he said, his voice lower than usual. I tried to keep things light, asking about his plans for the day as I continued cleaning. But I couldn't ignore how his gaze followed me, how it stayed a little too long when I reached up to dust the top shelves. My shirt rode up slightly, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw his jaw tighten. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But then it happened. I stretched too far, lost my balance, and before I knew it, Jake's hands were on my waist, steadying me. His grip was firm yet gentle, and the warmth of his touch sent an unexpected shiver through me. When our eyes met, the air shifted. It was no longer just a casual touch. His hands didn't move right away. Neither did mine. For a moment, we stood frozen, too close, too aware. I stepped back, clearing my throat, pretending nothing had happened. But the way he looked at me said otherwise. If I had known what was coming next, I would have stopped it right there. The tension lingered long after that moment. I tried to shake it off, focusing on cleaning, but my mind kept replaying the way Jake's hands had felt on my waist. I told myself it was harmless, just an innocent mistake. But the way he looked at me said otherwise. I moved to the kitchen, scrubbing countertops to distract myself. Moments later, Jake appeared again, leaning against the doorway like before. Only this time, his gaze was more deliberate, more intense. "Need any help?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something that made my pulse quicken. "I think I've got it," I replied, keeping my tone light, but my hands trembled slightly as I wiped the counter. He didn't leave. Instead, he stepped closer, reaching past me to grab a glass from the cabinet. His arm brushed against mine, and I froze. The contact was brief, but it sent a ripple of heat through me. I turned quickly, but in doing so, my arm bumped his, causing the glass to slip from his hand. Reflexively, he reached out, catching it just in time. But as he did, his other hand grazed my hip. "Careful," he said, his voice low, almost teasing. I laughed nervously, stepping away. "Guess I'm a little jumpy today." He smiled, but it wasn't his usual boyish grin. It was different. I tried to continue cleaning, but Jake stayed close, leaning against the counter as he talked about school and his plans for the summer. His words were casual, but his eyes weren't. They followed me, tracing every movement I made. At one point, I bent down to grab a cloth from the lower cabinet. When I stood up, I felt him behind me, closer than he should have been. My breath caught as his chest brushed against my back. "Sorry," he murmured, stepping back, but the heat of his body lingered. I turned around to face him, but before I could say anything, he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to stop it. But instead, I stood there, letting the moment stretch between us. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. The air between us felt heavier with each passing minute. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but my mind kept replaying those brief touches. The way Jake's fingers lingered, the warmth of his body so close to mine. After a while, I decided to take a break. I poured myself a glass of water and sat on the couch, hoping the distance would help clear my head. But Jake followed, sitting on the opposite end, his eyes never leaving mine. "You seem tense," he said softly, leaning forward. I forced a laugh. "Just a busy morning, I guess." He didn't smile this time. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You don't have to pretend with me, Rachel." His words hung in the air, and my heart raced. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Before I could think, he reached out, brushing his fingertips along my knee. I froze. His touch was light, almost testing, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I looked up and met his gaze. There was something undeniable in his eyes, something that made my stomach tighten and my breath hitch. "Jake," I whispered, but I couldn't finish the sentence. He shifted closer, his hand sliding up just enough to make my skin tingle. I should have stopped him right then and there. I should have stood up and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I let him lean in, his face inches from mine. I could feel the heat of his breath on my lips, and for a split second, I wanted to give in. Then reality snapped back. I pulled away quickly, standing up so fast I almost knocked over my glass. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. Jake stood too, his expression unreadable. "I know," he replied, but there was no regret in his voice, just determination. Before I could say anything else, he reached out, brushing his thumb against my wrist. My skin burned under his touch, and the part of me that knew better was fighting against the part that didn't want him to stop. "I can't do this," I said, pulling my hand away. But as I turned to leave, I knew it wasn't the end. Not even close. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the closed door after Jake left. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. I wanted to believe that moment in the kitchen had been a mistake, a fleeting lapse in judgment. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to busy myself with chores, but it was useless. My mind kept replaying his touch, the heat in his eyes, the way my body had responded despite every alarm ringing in my head. Hours passed, and I told myself things would go back to normal. I told myself that Jake would forget about it, that I could brush it off and pretend it never happened. But when he appeared again, leaning casually against the living room doorway, I knew I'd been lying to myself. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes said something else entirely. I swallowed hard, pretending not to notice the way he looked at me. "I'm almost done." He stepped closer anyway, taking a cloth from my hands. "You missed a spot," he said, his voice low as he leaned in. My breath caught as his arm brushed against mine, deliberate, lingering. I turned to look at him, but the intensity in his gaze stole my words. "Jake, we can't," I whispered, but even as I said it, my voice wavered. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his voice daring but soft. I couldn't. Instead, I froze as his hand slid down my arm, his fingers lightly tracing my skin. My body betrayed me, leaning into his touch as if I had no control. He stepped closer, his lips just inches from mine. "Tell me you don't want this," he whispered. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. His hand moved to my waist, pulling me against him. My pulse raced, my breath shallow as his lips brushed against mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, but when I didn't pull away, it deepened. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it. The heat, the intensity, the way he made me feel wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. But just as quickly, reality hit me. I pushed him away, my breath ragged. "We can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake stepped back, but his eyes never left mine. "I don't believe you," he said softly. And the worst part? I didn't believe myself either. I paced the room after Jake left, my heart pounding and my skin still burning from his touch. I told myself it had to stop, that it was just a moment of weakness. But the way he looked at me, the hunger in his eyes, lingered in my thoughts. Later that evening, I was folding laundry in the bedroom, trying to focus on anything but him. But then, I heard a soft knock at the door. "Rachel." His voice was low, almost hesitant. I froze, my hands gripping the fabric in front of me. "What is it, Jake?" The door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the dim light of the hallway. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt my resolve weakening again. He hesitated, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I can't stop thinking about earlier." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stand tall. "Jake, we agreed it was a mistake." "Did we?" he asked, stepping closer. I tried to back away, but the bed stopped me. He was too close now, and the tension between us was unbearable. "This is wrong," I said, but my voice betrayed me, trembling as his fingers brushed against my arm. "Then tell me to leave," he whispered, his lips so close I could feel his breath on my skin. I couldn't say it. Instead, I gasped as his hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer until our bodies touched. My hands rose to his chest, but instead of pushing him away, they stayed there, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my neck, and a shiver ran through me. "Tell me you don't feel this," he murmured. I closed my eyes, my breath catching as his lips found mine. The kiss was slow, deliberate, and everything inside me screamed to stop it. But I didn't. Instead, I gave in, my hands gripping his shoulders as the kiss deepened. His hands roamed my back, pulling me closer, and for a moment, I forgot everything else. Then reality hit. I pushed him away, breathing heavily as I turned my back to him. "We can't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't move. "You don't mean that," he said softly. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew he was right. I stood there with my back to him, my breath still unsteady. I wanted to tell him to leave, to make this stop before it went too far. But the heat of his presence behind me was impossible to ignore. "Rachel," he said softly, stepping closer. I felt his fingers brush my arm, light but deliberate. My skin tingled under his touch, and I cursed myself for not pulling away. "This has to stop," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Then why aren't you stopping me?" he whispered, his breath warm against my neck. I shivered as his hand slid to my waist, his fingers pressing just firmly enough to make me melt. My eyes closed, and I hated how much my body betrayed me, leaning into him instead of stepping away. "Jake!" My voice trembled, but he didn't let me finish. His lips brushed against my shoulder, soft and lingering, and I couldn't stop the sharp breath that escaped me. "I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured, his lips trailing up to my neck. I turned around, intending to stop him. But the moment our eyes met, every ounce of resistance crumbled. Before I could think, his hands cupped my face and his mouth captured mine. The kiss was deeper this time, hungrier, as if all the tension between us finally snapped. I didn't fight it. I let my hands slide up his chest, gripping his shirt as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My body burned under his touch, and I hated how much I wanted him in that moment. But then footsteps. We both froze. "Mark!" I whispered in panic, shoving Jake back as I tried to fix my hair and smooth out my clothes. Jake stepped away quickly, his face flushed as he ran a hand through his hair. The sound of the front door opening sent a wave of guilt crashing over me. I couldn't believe how far we'd let it go. How close we'd come to crossing the line completely. Mark called out from the hallway, and I forced myself to step out of the bedroom, praying my face wouldn't give me away. "Hey," he said with a smile, completely oblivious. He leaned in and kissed my cheek, and I tried not to flinch. Jake walked out moments later, his expression calm and composed. But when our eyes met, I saw it, the fire that hadn't burned out. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Dinner that evening was unbearable. Mark sat across from me, talking about his trip, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Jake sat quietly, barely touching his food, but his eyes would meet mine every so often, lingering, filled with the same hunger that had almost consumed us earlier. I forced myself to smile, to nod at Mark's stories, but my thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened in the bedroom. The way Jake's hands felt on my skin, the way my body had responded despite every voice in my head screaming to stop. After dinner, Mark headed to his office to finish some paperwork, leaving Jake and me alone in the living room. I pretended to focus on folding laundry, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning through every layer of restraint I tried to build. When I finally looked up, he was standing there, closer than I realized. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "There's nothing to talk about," I whispered, even as my heart raced. "Stop pretending," he said, stepping closer. "You feel it too. I know you do." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I backed up until I hit the wall, and Jake closed the space between us. His hands rested on either side of me, caging me in. My breathing hitched as his body hovered inches from mine. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "Then tell me to leave," he whispered, his lips so close to mine I could feel the heat radiating between us. I couldn't say it. Instead, I gasped as his lips brushed against mine, gentle at first, but quickly deepening. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me against him, and my resistance shattered. I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair as his mouth moved down my neck, leaving a trail of heat that made me dizzy. But then we heard it, the sound of Mark's footsteps approaching. We jumped apart just in time for Mark to walk into the room. He glanced between us, oblivious to the tension that still lingered in the air. "What are you two up to?" he asked casually. "Just helping with the laundry," Jake said smoothly, flashing a calm smile. Mark nodded and walked away, but my heart was still pounding. I looked at Jake, and his eyes told me everything. This wasn't over. Not even close. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake, his hands, his lips, the fire in his eyes that refused to fade. My body still burned from his touch, but my mind was drowning in guilt. I kept telling myself it had to stop, that we'd already gone too far. But the way he looked at me at dinner, the way he kissed me against that wall, I knew this wasn't something we could ignore. The next morning, I tried to avoid him. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with dishes and cleaning. But it didn't matter. I felt him before I saw him, standing behind me, close enough that I could feel his heat. "You're avoiding me," he said softly. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. "We can't do this, Jake." "Stop lying to yourself," he said, stepping closer. "You don't want me to stop." I turned around, ready to push him away, but the moment our eyes met, I froze. His gaze was dark, intense, and filled with need. "Jake," I started, but the words disappeared as his hand slid to my waist, pulling me against him. "This is dangerous," I whispered, even as my hands rose to his chest, trembling. "So stop me," he murmured, leaning in until his lips were just inches from mine. I couldn't. Instead, my fingers clutched his shirt, pulling him closer as his mouth captured mine. The kiss was desperate, almost frantic, as if we both knew how wrong it was but couldn't resist. His hands moved over my body, igniting every nerve as my back pressed against the counter. My breathing quickened, my thoughts spinning as his lips trailed down my neck. But then, footsteps. We broke apart just as Mark's voice called from the other room. "Rachel? Where are you?" Jake stepped back quickly, his breathing as ragged as mine. "I'll go," he whispered, brushing his fingers against my arm one last time before disappearing through the back door. I stood there, my heart pounding, my lips still tingling from his kiss. By the time Mark walked in, I'd managed to compose myself, but the guilt was unbearable. And yet, even as I stood there pretending nothing had happened, I knew it wouldn't be the last time. The next few days were torture. Jake and I barely spoke, but every time we crossed paths, the tension was undeniable. My mind replayed every stolen moment, his touch, his kiss, the fire between us that refused to die. I told myself it had to end, that it was over, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. And when I finally found myself alone with him again, I knew there was no turning back. It was late. Mark had gone out to meet some friends, leaving the house eerily quiet. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to read, when I heard Jake come in. He didn't say a word. Instead, he sat down beside me, his knee brushing against mine. I tried to ignore the heat that spread through me, but then his hand rested lightly on my thigh. I froze. "Jake, we can't," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against my ear. "Tell me you don't want this," he said, his voice low and rough. I couldn't. Instead, I turned toward him, and before I could think, his lips were on mine. This time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was urgent, hungry, and my body responded instantly. My fingers tangled in his hair as his hands explored my body, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. His lips moved down my neck, and I gasped as his teeth grazed my skin. My pulse raced, my breathing shallow as his hands slid beneath my shirt, igniting a fire I couldn't control. "Jake," I whispered, but it wasn't a protest. It was a plea. We moved together, our bodies tangled as the heat between us grew unbearable. For the first time, I didn't think about Mark or the consequences. I didn't think about anything except the way Jake made me feel, alive, wanted, completely out of control. But then the sound of the garage door opening shattered the moment. We jumped apart, both of us breathing heavily as the reality of what we'd just done sank in. "Go," I whispered, pushing him toward the hallway. He hesitated, his eyes locked on mine. "This isn't over," he said softly before disappearing into his room. I barely had time to fix my hair and straighten my clothes before Mark walked in, smiling as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And as I stood there pretending everything was fine, I knew the worst was yet to come. The guilt hit me the moment Mark kissed my cheek that night. His warmth, his trust, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But even as I sat beside him, pretending everything was normal, my body still burned from Jake's touch. I tried to convince myself it was over, that what happened with Jake would stay in the past. But deep down, I knew the truth. The tension between us hadn't faded, it had only grown stronger. The next day, I found myself alone in the house with Jake again. I avoided him at first, but it didn't last long. He found me in the bedroom, folding laundry, and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said softly. I looked up, my heart pounding. "Jake, we can't do this anymore." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Then tell me you don't want me." I opened my mouth to say it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he cupped my face, his touch sending shivers through me. "Stop fighting it," he whispered before capturing my lips in a kiss. I melted into him, my hands clutching his shirt as he pulled me against him. The heat between us flared again, stronger than ever, and I couldn't stop myself this time. His hands moved over my body, pushing me back onto the bed as his lips trailed down my neck. My pulse raced, my breath coming in sharp gasps as we crossed the final line, giving in completely to the desire that had been building for so long. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. When it was over, we lay there in silence, our breaths still heavy. Reality hit me like a wave, and I sat up quickly, pulling the sheets around me. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice shaking. Jake reached for me, but I pulled away. "I mean it, Jake. We have to stop." He didn't argue. Instead, he nodded, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. The days that followed were tense. We avoided being alone together, and Jake eventually started spending more time out of the house. I thought the distance would help, but the guilt never faded. Mark never suspected a thing. He continued to trust me completely, and that only made it worse. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that we stopped before it went any further. But the truth is, some lines, once crossed, are impossible to erase. Call to action. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to like the video, comment below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Stay tuned for the next twist-filled tale.